There is something nobody prepares you for when a version of yourself stops working. Not the collapse itself. You expected some version of that, even if the shape of it surprised you. What nobody prepares you for is the silence afterward. The strange, disorienting quiet of standing in the wreckage of a life that used to make sense, realizing you cannot find the thread back to who you were before it fell. You have probably been told in some form that this feeling means something went wrong. That is the lie this book exists to dismantle. Here is what is actually true. It will take time before it stops sounding like comfort you are not sure you deserve. The collapse did not happen to interrupt your life. It happened because your old self finally reached the outer limit of what it was capable of building, and it stepped aside, not gently, not on your schedule, but precisely. Think about the last time you tried to explain to someone close to you what you are going through. The words probably came out wrong, or you stopped before you finished because the feeling underneath was too large and too strange for the language you had available. You have been carrying something you do not yet have the right words for. What you are about to hear will give you those words, not as consolation, as coordinates. Once you know exactly where you are, the next move becomes visible in a way it simply could not be before. The person who pressed play on this is not the person who will finish it. That is not a promise made lightly. Chapter 1. The collapse was the correct address. Every civilization that has ever risen and fallen left behind the same story, written in different languages but carrying the same shape. There is a moment when a person's old life stops working. Not gradually, not with warning. It stops the way a bridge stops, suddenly, completely, and with a sound you will never forget. Across every era and every culture, the people who eventually built something lasting almost always passed through a period when everything collapsed at once. They did not know in that moment that the collapse was the point. They thought it was the punishment. You are in that moment right now, or you have just come through it. The reason this book found you is not coincidence. Something in you recognized the title. Something in you already suspects that what feels like an ending is actually a precise location, and that where you are standing right now is exactly where you needed to arrive. Here is the question this chapter is going to sit with for a while before it answers. Why does the collapse always feel like a personal flaw? Hold that question. Let it stay open. The answer is coming, but not yet. Right now, you are somewhere specific. Maybe you are between jobs and the explanation you give people feels thinner every time you say it. Maybe you are in a relationship that still technically exists, but the version of you who entered it no longer does. Maybe you made a financial decision that seemed reasonable 18 months ago, and now the consequence of it lives in your chest like a stone you carry from room to room. Maybe you simply woke up one morning and the person you had been performing for years was not there, and the silence where that person used to be felt enormous and dangerous and wrong. Wrong, that is the word most people use for this feeling. But wrong is not the right word. Wrong implies that there was a correct path you deviated from, a stable self you damaged, a life that was going well until something broke it. Wrong assumes that the old version of you was supposed to last. It was not. It was built for a particular distance, and it carried you that far, and then it gave out because it had reached the exact limit of what it was capable of building. The collapse is not evidence of your failure. It is evidence of your arrival. Bring to mind the person you were before these last 3 years unfolded, as it really was. not in terms of a dress or job title, in terms of who you believed yourself to be. Think about what you were certain of. Think about what you would have refused to question. Think about the story you told yourself about how your life was going to go, the one you had been telling long enough that it stopped feeling like a story and started feeling like reality. That version of you had a ceiling. Every version of every person has a ceiling. The question is never whether you will hit it. The question is only whether you will recognize what hitting it means. Most people do not recognize it. Most people hit the ceiling and conclude that something is wrong with them specifically. They look at people around them whose ceilings are not yet visible and decide those people must be fundamentally different, more capable, more worthy of a life that keeps expanding. They spend enormous energy trying to repair and restore the self that collapsed, pouring concrete back into a foundation that was not supposed to hold another floor. You have probably done some of that. Most people do. It is not weakness. It is the only response that makes sense when no one has told you that the collapse was supposed to happen. There was a man named Marcus who ran a print shop in a small city for 11 years. He was not famous, not wealthy, but he was consistent. And consistency had always been the thing he was most proud of. He showed up. He built the business slowly and carefully. He did everything the right way, meaning he did everything the way he had decided the right way looked when he was 26 years old and trying to prove something. By the time he was 37, the shop was failing. Digital changed the industry faster than he had planned for. The clients he had built his entire model around were simply not there anymore in the same numbers. He spent 2 years trying to save it. He took out a loan. He hired a consultant who told him to do things he already knew would not work. He restructured 3 times. And then the shop closed. For 8 months after that, Marcus could not explain himself to anyone in a way that felt true. His identity had been the shop. His competence, his worth, his story, all of it lived inside that business. When it closed, he felt like he had closed too. He told his brother he felt like he was waiting to find out who he was supposed to be next. His brother said that sounded like depression. Marcus nodded and did not say what he was actually thinking, which was that it felt less like sickness and more like standing in an empty room, stripped of furniture, looking at the walls for the first time. That emptiness was not a symptom. That was the room revealing its actual dimensions. Within 14 months, Marcus had rebuilt, not the shop, something different, a consulting practice for small manufacturers navigating digital integration, built entirely from the specific failure he had just lived through. His expertise was not abstract. It was exact. It was built from the precise coordinates of his collapse. The collapse told him where he was, and where he was turned out to be the only place from which what came next could be built. Here is the principle. This is the one that will carry you through everything that follows in this book. Every version of you has a range. It can operate within that range, build within that range, earn within that range, love within that range. But it cannot go past it. The beliefs and behaviors and self-concept that make up that version of you are also the walls of it. The only way to build beyond the current range is to leave the version that created the ceiling. And leaving a version of yourself is not something you can do gently or gradually, no matter how much you wish it were otherwise. You do not slowly upgrade a self. You grieve one and build the next. This is the funeral metaphor, and you will hear it again in this book, much later from a completely different angle. For now, just hear this part. The grief you feel around a collapsing identity is real grief. It belongs to the same family as the grief you feel when a person leaves. Something that was alive in your daily experience of yourself is no longer alive in the same way. That is a real loss. You are allowed to feel it fully, and feeling it does not mean you are broken or weak or behind. It means you are honest. What you are not allowed to do, if you want what comes next, is confuse the grief for the verdict. Now back to the question that has been waiting. Why does the collapse always feel like a personal flaw? It feels that way because the culture you grew up inside has an unspoken rule. The rule is that a good life is a continuous life, a coherent narrative, a self that compounds forward without interruption, without contradiction, without the embarrassment of needing to become something different from what you already were. The rule says that people who have to start over failed. The rule says that consistency is the evidence of competence. The rule says that if something collapsed, you should have seen it coming, and if you did not, that is proof of something wrong with you. That rule is the villain of this book, though it has no face. It is not a person. It is a pressure. It is the quiet voice that makes you feel you need to explain the gap, justify the restart, apologize for the space between who you were and who you are still becoming. It has kept more people trapped in shrinking versions of themselves than almost any other force. Because you cannot build something new while you are still defending something finished. The collapse was not an interruption of your path. It was the path, delivering you to the only address from which the next thing can begin. There is something later in this book that directly contradicts what most people believe about fresh starts, about what it actually takes to begin again, about what you have to be willing to carry forward and what you must be willing to leave. When you encounter it, the contradiction will resolve in a way that changes what you do on an ordinary Tuesday morning. But that comes later. Right now, this is enough. You are not behind, you are located. The question the next chapter will answer is this: if the collapse is a coordinate, what exactly is it pointing toward? Chapter 2: Mourning a Self That Was Costing You Everything. Here is something almost everyone believes about grief. They believe it belongs only to death, to loss, to the things taken from you without your permission. Everyone around you holds that belief. It shapes how they respond when your life changes, when your plans collapse, when the version of yourself you were trying to be simply stops working. They offer condolences when someone dies. They offer advice when an old self dies. That is the problem, hidden inside a distinction most people never notice. Grief for a self is not weakness. It is not confusion. It is not a sign that you are moving in the wrong direction. What you are about to hear will likely contradict everything you were taught about what it means to let a version of yourself go. By the end of this chapter, you will understand why the grief you may be carrying right now is not the obstacle. It is the proof that the transition is already working. That question hung at the end of the last chapter. If the collapse is a coordinate, what is it pointing toward? You deserve a real answer, not a motivational answer, not a soft reassurance dressed in borrowed courage. A real one. But before that answer can land, before it can do anything useful inside you, you need something first. You need permission to mourn. Most people skip this step. They hear that collapse is useful, that reinvention is possible, that the old self had to go, and they try to perform the acceptance without doing the grieving. They nod. They say they understand. They keep moving. And 3 months later, they are still circling the same feelings, still waking up with a weight on their chest they cannot name, still wondering why the forward motion they keep choosing does not feel like forward motion at all. The weight has a name. It is grief. Ordinary, necessary, completely overlooked grief. Go back to the person you were before these last 3 years unfolded, as it really was. Not in terms of what you had or had not achieved, but in terms of who you thought you were going to be by now. There was a version of yourself you were building toward, a picture that felt specific enough to believe in. Maybe it was financial, maybe it was relational, maybe it was just a feeling of having finally figured something out, of having solid ground under you. Whatever it was, you carried it like a quiet plan, and at some point something happened. The plan stopped being available. The ground shifted. The version of yourself you were becoming began to cost more than it could ever return. That is the self this chapter is about, not the self who failed, not the self who was lazy or careless or made bad decisions, the self who was simply no longer viable. The self who worked very hard for a very long time inside a framework that could not hold what you actually needed and eventually ran out of room. There is a difference between failing and becoming obsolete. Failure suggests a mistake. Obsolescence is just time doing what time does to every structure that refuses to evolve. Your old self did not necessarily fail. It ran its course. It spent itself down, and now it is gone, or close enough to gone that you are reading this book, which means the question is not whether to grieve. The question is whether you are willing to grieve it properly. Let me tell you about a woman named Carla. Carla spent 9 years building a career she believed in. She was a project manager at a mid-sized logistics company, and she was exceptional at the work. She stayed late. She solved the problems her colleagues walked past. She built a reputation quietly and deliberately, the way someone builds a house, brick by brick, with no shortcuts. At 31, she was passed over for the senior role she had been preparing for across 3 annual reviews. The person hired instead had spent 4 of those years at a competing firm. He had the same skills. He had a better network and a more visible presence on the platforms where people in her industry were watching each other. Carla did not fall apart. That was the thing everyone respected about her. She kept coming to work. She kept performing. She told herself the next opportunity would come. She managed the grief the way most people manage it, by not managing it at all. 2 years later, she left, not for something better. She left because she could no longer locate, inside herself, any version of who she had been when she started. She left in pieces. And the thing that finally cracked the controlled surface was not anger. It was a specific moment in a parking garage. She realized she had been mourning the loss of that self for 2 full years without ever giving herself permission to call it mourning. She had been calling it motivation. She had been calling it resilience. She had been calling it moving forward. It was grief, and it needed to be called what it was before it could finish its work. Here is what Carla learned in the months that followed. The grief was not about the promotion. The grief was about the person she had been while pursuing it. That woman had a particular kind of certainty. She knew who she was inside the structure she was building. When the structure proved unreliable, the certainty went with it. What Carla was mourning was not failure. She was mourning a self that had been real and functional and genuinely hers and was now simply gone. That is the grief this book is asking you to honor, because here is the revelation, the one hiding inside all of that pain. Grief for an old identity is not regret. It is recognition. It means you understood the value of what that self contained. It means you were present for it. It means you were invested. And that is the same condition required for the next version of yourself to take root. You cannot invest deeply in a future self if you never invested deeply in a past one. The grief is the proof of the investment, and the investment is the very quality that makes you capable of building again. What prevents the transition from completing is not the grief. What prevents it is the conflation of grief with failure. This is what continuity bias does to people. Continuity bias is the deep cultural assumption that a good life is an unbroken line, that the person you are at 35 should be a smooth, logical extension of the person you were at 25. That any gap, any collapse, any significant discontinuity in your self-narrative is evidence of a wrong turn. It is the voice that says you should have stayed consistent. It is the pressure that makes reinvention feel like confession. And it is everywhere. It is in the way resumes are designed, with no room for the years you spent rebuilding. It is in the way families ask questions at holidays, assuming the last version of you is still the current version. It is in the way social timelines make every change visible, every gap public, every discontinuity available for interpretation by people who have never experienced one themselves. Continuity bias is not personal. It is structural. It is the frame through which almost everyone around you understands a life, and it costs people everything. Because it turns necessary grief into unnecessary shame. And unnecessary shame is the one thing that can stop a transition cold. There is a difference between standing at a grave and feeling the loss fully, and standing at a grave certain you are the one who deserves to be in it. The first is healthy. The second is continuity bias wearing the mask of self-reflection. You are allowed to stand at the grave of who you were. You are allowed to feel the weight of that loss without converting it into evidence of your inadequacy. You are allowed to say, that version of me was real, I valued it, it is gone now. That is genuinely hard, and I am going to let it be hard, and then I am going to do what comes next. This is what a necessary funeral looks like, not a performance of sadness, not a dramatic gesture, a quiet, private act of honest recognition. You acknowledge what was. You do not pretend the loss is fine. You do not rush past the ceremony to prove you are already healed. You stand there in the full feeling of it and you let it complete. Open loops do not close themselves. Grief that is refused does not disappear. It finds other forms. It becomes anxiety or inertia or a low-grade numbness that makes everything slightly harder than it should be. You have likely felt some version of this already. That persistent heaviness that does not quite match your current circumstances. That is usually a grief that was handed a different label and never allowed to finish. This chapter will not hand you the next step before you have taken this one. Because the coordinate the collapse is pointing toward, the answer you came here for, cannot be read clearly until the lens is clean. And grief, properly done, cleans the lens. Let the old self have its ceremony. Let it be honored for what it was worth, which was considerable, which was real, which was yours. And then, when the ceremony ends, you will not be standing in an ending. You will be standing at the first moment of something exact. The next chapter will show you what the coordinate reveals once you are willing to read it. And what you find there will not be what you expect. Chapter 3. Every wealthy person has a collapse story. The coordinate your collapse gave you does not point toward where you fell. It points toward where you are supposed to go next. That sounds like the kind of comfort people offer when they want you to stop grieving. It is not. It is an observation about a pattern so consistent across the biographies of people who built real, lasting wealth that ignoring it becomes its own kind of blindness. The pattern is this: collapse came first, not after they built something, not as a test they passed along the way. Before. Collapse was the first chapter, not the twist ending. And if you have recently lost something, or if your old identity feels like clothes that no longer fit, or if the version of yourself that made sense 3 years ago has quietly stopped being available, then what you are experiencing is not a detour. It is the most common entry point in the stories of people who eventually built something real. The question this chapter will answer is why that is true. The answer will not be what most people expect. You probably know someone who seems to have always had it together. Steady job, steady income, no catastrophic gaps in the story. On the surface, that looks like the blueprint: consistency, progress without rupture, a life without the mess of starting over. The culture sells this version hard. There is even a name for the belief that drives it: continuity bias. It is the deep, mostly unconscious assumption that a good life is an unbroken line, that the self you built in your 20s should naturally extend into your 30s and 40s without being dismantled, that any deviation from that forward march is evidence of failure rather than evidence of something else entirely. Continuity bias is the villain in more financial stories than people realize. Not market crashes, not bad timing, not even poor decisions. The belief that the line should never break is what keeps people rebuilding the same broken version of themselves over and over, instead of recognizing that the break itself was the message. Here is what the coordinate actually reveals. Remember the person you were before these last 3 years unfolded as it really was, not where you hoped to be, where you actually were, what you were tolerating, what you had stopped questioning, what you had organized your entire identity around without ever consciously choosing it. Some people, when they sit with that honestly, realize the version of themselves that existed 3 years ago was not a person they built on purpose. It was a person they inherited from other people's expectations, from decisions made when they had less information, from a version of safety that had an expiration date no one told them about. Now ask yourself what it would have taken for that person to voluntarily walk away from what they had. The honest answer for most people is nothing short of collapse. That is not a flaw in human nature. It is the mechanism. James Calloway was 41 years old when the 2 worst phone calls of his life arrived in the same week. The first came from his employer on a Tuesday afternoon. 18 years of consistent performance, 2 regional leadership awards, and a corner office on the 11th floor. It was over in a 12-minute call. Budget restructuring. His entire division eliminated. The second call was not a call at all. It was a conversation at the kitchen table on a Thursday night that his wife had clearly been preparing for much longer than he had any idea. She was calm. That was the part he said he remembered most. The marriage had been hollow for years. They had both known it and not spoken it. Now she was speaking it. By the following Monday, James had no job title, no marriage, and no clear answer to the question of who he was without either one. For 4 months, he barely left his apartment. He described that period later as the most frightening of his life. Not because of the practical losses, though those were real, but because of the silence where his identity used to be. He had defined himself so completely through his position and his role as a husband that without both, there was no inner voice telling him what to do next. There was just space. At first, space felt like nothing, like erasure. Then something shifted. He started noticing in that strange, empty stretch of time that he had always wanted to acquire distressed commercial properties, not as a hobby, as a real business. He had never pursued it because the career had been going well, and you do not abandon what is working. Except it had not really been working. It had been paying. There is a difference, and James had confused the two for almost 2 decades. The collapse did not give him a new idea. It gave him back an old one he had buried under the weight of a life that felt too complete to interrupt. 3 years after that kitchen table conversation, James owned 4 commercial properties outright and was in contract on a 5th. He had not gotten lucky. He had not stumbled into a windfall. He had done the slow, unglamorous work of learning a new domain, making early mistakes with small stakes, and building a competence that the previous version of himself would never have had the time or the humility to develop. The collapse was not a detour around his success. It was the road. Now here is the thing that most people get wrong when they hear a story like James's. They hear it as an exception. They file it under remarkable resilience, extraordinary willpower, one of those people who just have what it takes. And the moment they do that, they make it irrelevant to their own life. They put it in a category labeled other people and move on. But James's story is not remarkable for being rare. It is remarkable for being so ordinary. Pull the early biography of nearly anyone who built real, lasting wealth from a standing start, not inherited money, not a lucky windfall, but genuine financial reinvention, and you will find a collapse. Sometimes it is a business failure. Sometimes it is a health crisis that forced a stop. Sometimes it is the end of a relationship that had been the whole architecture of a life. The form varies. The function is almost always the same. Collapse removes the structures that were holding the old self in place. That is worth sitting with for a moment. The old self does not leave because you decide to improve. It leaves because the conditions that sustained it are gone. This is precisely what continuity bias cannot prepare you for. The culture tells you that a good life is the one that never had to stop, but the data in the actual lives of people who built wealth tells a different story. The stopping was the starting. In a later section, we will get to a point about momentum that overturns the common assumption. After that really registers, it immediately changes how you act on the days when forward motion feels impossible. But for now, let us stay with the mechanism. Understanding it is what separates the people who use their collapse from the people who simply survive it. Every collapse contains something that can only be called coordinates, not a map. Coordinates are different from a map. A map shows you a route someone else already traveled. Coordinates show you a location. What you do with that location, the direction you choose to move from it, that part is yours. The collapse you experienced, whether it was financial, relational, professional, or some quiet internal unraveling that never had a name, that collapse landed you somewhere specific. It removed the noise of the old life. And in that removal, if you are willing to look, you will find information about yourself that was always true but had no room to surface while the old structures were intact. What did you want before the world told you what was practical? What did you stop asking yourself because the answer was inconvenient? What did you notice, in the silence after the fall, that you have been too afraid to take seriously? Those are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions James asked himself in that apartment. They are the questions that, when answered honestly and followed with real action, produce a different life than the one the collapse interrupted. The funeral metaphor has been present in this book since the beginning, introduced as grief because that is how it first arrives. You are not wrong to grieve. Something real died. The self that organized your identity around that career or that relationship or that version of your future was a real self. It is gone. The loss is worth mourning. But here in this chapter something else becomes possible. The funeral does not have to be a thing that happens to you. You can preside over it. You can be the one who stands at the front of the room, not shattered by the loss but clear-eyed about what the life of that old self actually cost you. The things you did not pursue, the risks you did not take, the version of yourself that got smaller every year so that the old life could stay intact. You can grieve what was real and still be glad the story changed. That is not a contradiction. That is the most honest thing this chapter can offer you. The open question this chapter introduced at the start was why collapse precedes wealth creation so consistently. The answer, now fully visible, is this: wealth at the level that changes a life requires a version of you that the old life had no room to create. The old structures were not just professionally limiting, they were personally limiting. They kept a certain you in charge, a you defined by what it had already survived and already proven, and that you had stopped asking the questions that growth requires. Collapse removed that you, reluctantly, painfully, completely. And what remained was not nothing. What remained was the starting condition. You are not behind. You are positioned. Chapter 4. The old self was the ceiling, not the floor. Something is draining from your life right now, and it has no sound. It does not announce itself. It does not leave a mark on the wall where you could measure it, but it is leaving. Every week you spend defined by who you used to be is a week your actual earning capacity sits locked behind a door you are holding shut with your own two hands. The loss is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is the opportunity you did not recognize because your old identity told you it was not meant for you. It is the conversation you did not start, the number you did not name, the room you did not enter because the person you believed yourself to be would not have done those things. That belief is costing you, compounding daily, invisibly. The way interest charges on a debt you forgot you carried. The mechanism is not bad luck. It is not bad timing. It is an old identity still running in the background of your life like an outdated program slowing everything down. And this chapter is about what happens when that program finally gets deleted. Positioned. That is the word that ended the last chapter. You are not behind. You are positioned. Let that word do its work for a moment before we move forward. Where you are positioned matters enormously, and so does what you are positioned above. Here is the question that will live inside this chapter until we close it. It is a question worth sitting with. If the self that collapsed was actually the thing that was holding you back, why did losing it feel like falling? Hold that. We will return to it. A man named James once described his old life to me in a way I have never forgotten. He said it felt like wearing a suit that fit him perfectly when he was 24. By the time he was 31, he said, he could not tell the suit had gotten smaller. He just noticed, gradually, that he could not breathe very deeply in it. He could not raise his arms all the way. Every big movement required him to calculate whether the seams would hold. James had built a solid, respected professional life. He was the dependable one in his family. He managed a mid-level operations role at a distribution company, owned a modest car, sent money home to his mother on the first of every month. He kept his savings in the same checking account where his paycheck landed, because the idea of moving money anywhere else felt like a gamble he was not allowed to take. He was careful. He was consistent. He was, by every measure his community valued, a success. And then the company restructured. His position disappeared inside a corporate document that he learned about from an email. 47 words. No meeting. No warning call. Just 47 words and the understanding that the stable, predictable, dependable life he had built was over. For 6 months, James described doing almost nothing. He applied for similar roles. He got close a few times. He told himself this was a temporary interruption and that the story of his life would continue as written. He was waiting for the suit to fit again. What broke the pattern was not a revelation. It was an accident. A former colleague invited him to a meeting he almost did not attend, a small gathering of people building independent consulting arrangements in his industry, people who charged for their expertise directly without a corporate structure around them. James sat in the back. He mostly listened, but halfway through the evening, someone asked him a question about a logistics problem they were trying to solve. James spent 45 minutes walking them through a framework he had developed quietly over 8 years and never once thought of as something he owned. Someone in that room told him afterward what that kind of knowledge was worth. The number landed like a foreign language. James went home and did not sleep. The dependable version of James, the one in the suit, would never have attended that meeting. The dependable version believed that knowledge lived inside an institution, that it belonged to the company, that extracting it and offering it independently was the kind of thing other people did. Bolder people, riskier people, not him. The stable identity he had built with such care had a precise, invisible ceiling. It told him exactly what he was worth. It told him exactly how high he was permitted to reach. And it told him those things so quietly, so consistently, so matter-of-factly that he had never once thought to question whether the ceiling was real. The collapse removed the suit, not gently, but completely. Within 18 months, James was earning more than he had made in his best year at the company. Not because he had become a different person in terms of his values or his character. He was still careful. He was still consistent. He still sent money home on the first of the month. But he was doing all of those things from the other side of a ceiling that no longer existed. Think about this. The financial behaviors his old identity made impossible were not exotic or extreme. He was not suddenly reckless. He did not become someone who threw money at speculative schemes and chased improbable returns. What changed was far more structural. The old James could not name his price. Naming a price required the belief that his knowledge had market value independent of institutional approval. The old James could not pursue irregular income because irregular income was unsafe, and safety was the highest virtue his identity recognized. The old James could not turn down a stable but mediocre offer, because turning something down required a confidence in future options that his ceiling would not allow him to claim. The new James, the one who had buried the old self, mourned it, and eventually walked away from the grave, could do all of those things. Not because he was different, because the constraint was gone. That is the mechanism this whole chapter is built on. It is worth saying plainly. The identity that collapsed was not a foundation that got destroyed. It was a ceiling that finally broke. You did not lose the ground beneath you. You broke through the roof above you. The fact that it felt like falling does not mean you were falling. It means falling and breaking free can feel identical from the inside. Now answer that question from earlier. If the self that collapsed was the thing holding you back, why did losing it feel like falling? Because every ceiling looks like a sky when you have never seen above it. You did not know there was more. The identity you built carefully and genuinely over years and years told you that where you were was where you belonged. It told you, through every repeated decision and every avoided risk and every carefully maintained routine, that this was the right size for a life like yours. And you believed it. Of course you believed it. You had no evidence to the contrary. The ceiling was invisible because it was built from the inside. This is where continuity bias does its most dangerous work. Continuity bias is the quiet cultural pressure that insists a good life is an unbroken one. That the sign of a life well managed is a consistent, linear story with no ruptures, no restarts, no chapters that had to be torn out and rewritten. Society rewards the appearance of continuity. It gives you credit for stability, for predictability, for being the same person in the same place doing the same thing with escalating competence. And so when the rupture comes, when the collapse is real and the story breaks, every instinct tells you that you have failed, that the break itself is the proof of failure. But consider what continuity actually costs. Consider what you agree to when you protect an unbroken narrative at all expense. You agree to keep wearing the suit. You agree never to find out what your knowledge is worth outside the walls that first assigned it a value. You agree to let the ceiling define the sky. The self that had to leave was not the best version of you. It was the first serviceable version. It was the version that got you to this moment. And this moment, as strange and as painful as it may still feel, is the first moment you have existed above the line that version of you could not cross. Take a breath here. Turn back 3 years as honestly as you can, not where you thought you would be, but where you actually were. Think about the assumptions you were making about what was possible for you financially. Think about the ceiling you could not see. Then look at where you are now. At the wreckage. At the space around you that feels so uncomfortably open. That openness is not emptiness. It is room. You have never had this much room before. The funeral metaphor carries weight here. You have heard it earlier in this book, the idea that what you are experiencing is a kind of death, and that grief is the appropriate response. But there is something the funeral metaphor does not yet contain. Something that will come into full clarity later in this book, when the ceremony returns and you are standing at the front of it rather than being carried inside it. For now, understand this. You can grieve something and still be glad it is gone. Both of those things can be true at the same time. The person who held you to that ceiling deserved grief, and the ceiling deserved to break. James never went back to the suit. He kept it, folded in the back of a closet, not as a trophy, not as a reminder of how far he had come. He kept it because he said it helped him remember that comfort and containment can feel exactly the same. That a life shaped to fit perfectly around who you used to be is not a life designed for where you are going. The collapse was not the coordinates of your lowest point. The collapse was the coordinates of your first free position. The old self was not the ground beneath you. It was the glass above you. And glass, when it breaks, does not apologize for cutting on the way down. What will you build now that the ceiling is gone? Chapter 5. What survives a death is what you actually are. Losing everything is not the worst thing that can happen to you. That sounds like comfort from someone who has never truly lost anything. It is not. It is an observation about what loss actually does to a person when they stop fighting it long enough to look. Buried inside every collapse is a fact about you. No good fortune, no full bank account, no carefully maintained reputation could ever surface it on its own. You have to be emptied before you can see what the container actually holds. Right now, whether you chose this moment or it chose you, you are standing in exactly that kind of empty. The question is not how to fill yourself back up with what you had before. The question is what you discover when you finally look at what is still there. That question has been waiting for you since before this chapter began. Hold it. You just heard this. What will you build now that the ceiling is gone? Maybe you felt something when those words landed. A flicker. A small pulse of possibility that surprised you because you did not expect to feel it in the middle of grief. That pulse is not random. It is information. It is the first transmission from whatever is left of you after the old version walked out the door. It deserves your full attention before you do anything else. Here is what most people do instead. They catalog the losses. They run the inventory of what is missing, the income, the title, the relationship, the plan that made sense 2 years ago, the version of themselves that other people recognized and responded to. They make a list, consciously or not, of all the ways they are now less than they were. That list is not a lie. The losses are real, but it is an incomplete ledger. It counts only one column. The other column holds something harder to see and far more durable. Think about the last time your life broke apart in some significant way. Not a bad week, not a disappointment, a real fracture, the kind where the version of you that existed before that moment could not simply continue. Maybe it was financial. Maybe it was a relationship that organized your entire sense of who you were. Maybe it was a career you had wrapped your identity around so tightly that when it ended, you did not just lose a job. You lost a self. Think about what you did in the days and weeks after that. Not what you wished you had done. What you actually did. And somewhere in that honest recall, if you look carefully, you will find something that did not leave. Something that stayed, or came back, or showed up in a new form even when you were not looking for it. That is what this chapter is about. There is a word that gets used in metallurgy in the process of working with raw ore, and that word is assay. To assay something is to test it, to apply heat and pressure and observe what remains after the impurities burn away. The result of an assay is not a judgment, it is a measurement. It tells you what is actually there, stripped of everything that was only there because conditions allowed it. What remains after the fire is not a lesser version of the original material. It is the truest version, the one you can actually build with. Your collapse is an assay. Meet a woman named Iris. 41 years old, she had spent 17 years building a wholesale distribution company with her former husband. Not famous, not featured anywhere, just quietly successful, 2 warehouses, 14 employees, a business that worked. When the marriage ended, the business went with it. Not because the law required it, but because continuing meant being in daily contact with someone she could no longer be near. She walked away from the revenue. She walked away from the identity. She walked away from the professional network she had spent nearly 2 decades cultivating. Her friends expected her to spend a year grieving, and she did spend months in something that felt like grief, but something else was happening underneath it. She kept noticing in the quiet, in the mornings before she had enough coffee to perform normalcy, that she still cared about a very specific thing. Not distribution, not warehouses. The problem of how products that solve real problems fail to find the people who need them. That was the thing she had always been trying to solve, even when she called it by a different name. Even when it wore the costume of a marriage and a business model and a daily routine. After the collapse, she could see it clearly for the first time because everything else was gone. That clarity became the foundation of her next company. Not a copy of what she had before. Something more precise. Something that finally matched what she actually was. What was true about Iris was always true about Iris. The collapse did not create it. The collapse revealed it. Now here is the thing most people miss in that story. It is easy to miss because it feels like a small detail. Iris did not go looking for what remained. She noticed it. There is a difference between those 2 acts, and the difference matters enormously. Searching for your core is an anxious act. It implies you believe something is missing, and that belief shapes everything you find or fail to find. Noticing, on the other hand, is a receptive act. It requires you to be still enough to receive what is already broadcasting. What is already broadcasting in you right now, even in the middle of this, is not nothing. So let us do something slow here, something deliberate. Think about what you still care about, not what you think you should care about, not what made sense inside the old structure of your life. what you still actually care about when the pressure of performance is off. It might be something you have not given a name to. It might be something that other people around you do not particularly value, which is exactly why it survived, because it was never performing for anyone else. Think about what you still know. What knowledge lives in your body and your hands and your mind that did not walk out the door with the old identity? The skills you have that are not attached to a title. The things you can see that other people cannot see. Think about what still feels true. Not true as in correct or validated. True as in when you say it out loud or even just think it, something settles in your chest rather than contracts. That settling sensation is not trivial. It is your nervous system recognizing its own frequency. What you care about, what you know, what feels true. Those three things are your actual building materials. Before long, we will get to a point about where money comes from that overturns the common assumption. Once that becomes real to you, it immediately changes what you do first every morning. For now, stay here. There is a force working against this kind of stillness. It is not laziness or fear, though both of those are present. The deeper force is what this book has been calling continuity bias, the cultural insistence that a coherent life is an unbroken one, that the measure of a person is the smoothness of their narrative arc. You know this pressure. You have felt it every time someone asked what you do and you had to explain what you used to do first. You have felt it every time someone from your past looked at you with a mixture of sympathy and quiet relief that their own story had not broken the way yours did. The world tends to treat collapse as evidence of a flaw, and if you absorbed that treatment even partially, you began to look at the aftermath of your own life as wreckage, as evidence of something wrong with you. It was never wreckage. It was always a distillation. The self that had to leave, that previous version of you that organized itself around a particular set of conditions, that self was not fake. It was real. It did what it came to do, but it was also a composite. It was made of what you genuinely were, plus all the adaptations you built to survive in a specific environment. The adaptations are not shameful, they are proof of intelligence, but they are not you. When the environment collapsed, the adaptations no longer had anything to attach to. What remained was the substrate, the original material, the part of you that predates every role you ever played. This is the funeral metaphor completing its first turn. In the early chapters, a funeral meant loss. It felt like grief because something real was ending. Grief is correct. There is no reason to skip it or perform your way past it. But a funeral is also a rite of separation. It marks the moment when you stop waiting for the departed to return and begin the work of living in their absence. You are not in the early stages of that grief anymore. You are somewhere further along. You are at the point where the loss has done its work. Now you can look clearly at what remains. What remains is not a lesser you. It is a distilled you. One more thing before this chapter ends. This one requires you to be honest with yourself in a way that might feel uncomfortable. Mirror yourself for a moment. Go back 3 full years as honestly as you can, not financially, not professionally, but in terms of what you knew about yourself. 3 years ago, did you know what you know right now about what you can survive? Did you know what you know right now about what you actually care about when nobody is watching? Did you know what you know right now about what feels true in your body versus what just felt acceptable? 3 years ago, you did not know those things, or you knew them the way you know a country on a map, without having walked the ground. You know them now the way you know a road you have actually driven in the dark. That knowledge is not collateral damage from your collapse. It is the inheritance. Every identity collapse is a distillation. What burns away was always temporary. What remains is always real. What exactly are you going to do with what remains? Chapter 6. Building on rubble is actually easier. Something is draining out of your life right now, and it is not dramatic enough to feel like a crisis. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a warning. It leaks steadily, quietly, one compromised day at a time, through the gap between the foundation you are standing on and the foundation you actually need. Every hour you spend trying to rebuild on top of a structure that was already broken is not a neutral hour. It is borrowed time. The energy you spend patching cracks in a wall that was never plumb is energy that cannot go toward building something that stands. And here is what nobody names clearly enough. The cost is not just the lost time. It is the compounding of the flaw itself. A house built on a crooked foundation does not get less crooked as it rises. It gets more crooked, more unstable with every floor, more dangerous the higher you climb. What you have in your hands right now, the rubble, the cleared ground, the silence where a whole life used to be, is not the worst version of your situation. It may be the best version you have ever had. That question from the last chapter still hangs in the air. What exactly are you going to do with what remains? Hold it. Do not answer it yet, because before you can answer it honestly, you need to understand why the rubble is not your enemy. There is a story told in construction circles about a man named 𝗓𝗧𝗡. He was a general contractor in a mid-sized city, the kind of man who knew a building the way a doctor knows a body, by touch, by sound, by the particular way a structure settles under weight. A developer hired him to renovate a row of storefronts on a street that had seen better decades. The budget was modest. The timeline was tight. And the directive was clear: preserve as much of the existing structure as possible. Save every beam you can save. Every wall you do not have to touch, do not touch. 𝗓𝗧𝗡 walked through the buildings with his crew and knew immediately that the directive was wrong. The foundations were soft. The load-bearing walls had been modified by previous owners who did not understand load-bearing walls. The electrical had been rerouted so many times it looked like a diagram of anxiety. But the budget said, preserve. So they preserved. 18 months later, after the storefronts opened and drew tenants, the problems began. A door that would not close properly in winter. A ceiling that cracked along the same line no matter how many times it was patched. A smell in the corner unit that no one could locate because its source was sealed behind a wall nobody had opened. 𝗓𝗧𝗡 was called back. He stood in the corner unit, pressed his palm flat against the wall, and felt the faint give that told him everything. The rot was inside. It had been inside from the beginning. They had built a new surface over an old disease, and the disease had kept working in the dark. The second renovation cost more than the first, and this time they tore it down to the ground. What 𝗓𝗧𝗡 built after that teardown stood without complaint for 11 years. No cracked ceilings, no sealed smells, no doors that remembered a different shape. Here is the thing you need to sit with for a moment before the lesson makes its full weight felt. Most people, when they lose something large, a relationship that organized their sense of self, a career that gave them a role to inhabit, a financial position they had built their identity around, most people do exactly what that developer told 𝗓𝗧𝗡 to do. Preserve as much of the existing structure as possible. Get back to who you were. Pick up where you left off. Return to the prior version before the collapse gets too much distance on you, and you can feel the logic of it. The prior version had things this version does not: stability, momentum, an established story that made sense to other people. Returning to it feels like recovery. It feels like healing. The culture rewards it. People around you will call it resilience. But here is the question that has been sitting at the back of this chapter since the first paragraph. Now it is time to look at it directly. What if the structure you are trying to return to was already soft? What if the foundation was already wrong before the collapse happened, and the collapse simply made that wrongness visible? Look back at your ordinary days before these last 3 years unfolded, as it really was. Not in terms of what you had, the apartment, the income, the relationships, the title on the email signature. Think about what was working underneath all of that. Think about whether the pace of your growth was real, or whether you were patching the same cracks every 6 months and calling that maintenance. Think about whether the person you were presenting to the world 3 years ago was built on something solid, or built on a story you had told so many times you stopped checking whether it was still true. This is not about blame. The cracks were not your fault. Nobody teaches you how to inspect your own foundation. Nobody sits you down at 22 and shows you how to distinguish between real structural growth and the accumulation of a self-image that is one bad season away from failing. You did what you were taught to do. You preserved. You patched. You climbed. But now the collapse has happened, and something is different about collapsed ground. Collapsed ground is honest. When a wall comes down and the foundation is exposed, there is no more pretending about the condition of things. The rot that was sealed behind drywall is visible now. The crooked beams are lying in the open. And that visibility, that raw, uncomfortable, borderline humiliating visibility, is actually one of the most valuable things that can happen to a person. Because you cannot fix what you cannot see. And you could not see it before. Incremental growth from a flawed foundation does not correct the flaw. This is the mechanical truth that the culture of recovery never tells you. Incremental growth compounds the flaw. Every new layer of achievement, relationship, income, or identity that you build on top of a crooked base inherits the crookedness and amplifies it. The higher you climb, the more the original error matters, the more unstable the structure becomes. Until something, a market shift, a relationship ending, a single conversation that changes everything brings it down. And when it comes down from height, the damage is total. You did not fall from height, or if you did, you survived. You are here. And what you are standing on now is cleared ground. Level, exposed, and completely available for the first time in years, maybe the first time ever. This is the structural advantage that nobody names when they talk about starting over. They name the hardship. They name the grief. They name the loss of status and the disorientation of not knowing who you are without the thing that collapsed. All of that is real, and all of that has its place. But they do not name the advantage, because the advantage requires you to believe something that runs directly against the current of everything you were taught. The blank site is better than the compromised foundation. Not eventually better, not better after a long time, better right now today as a structural condition for building something that holds. There is a principle in architecture called site clearing. Before any serious structure goes up, you do not work around what is already there. You remove it. Everything that does not belong to the new design comes out, not because what was there was worthless, but because what is coming needs a clean relationship with the ground. It needs to know exactly what it is resting on. It needs every contact point with the earth to be intentional, specific, and load-bearing. You are at site clearing. That is not a metaphor for loss. That is a description of readiness. Now let us return to the question that opened this chapter, the one left hanging since you first heard it. What are you going to do with what remains? Here is the answer this chapter has been building toward from the first word. You are going to stop treating what remains as wreckage to be rebuilt, and start treating it as materials to be selected. There is a difference. And the difference is enormous. Wreckage implies you reassemble what existed before. Materials imply you choose what comes next. Some of what collapsed belongs in the new structure. Not all. Perhaps not even most. The parts of you that were already honest, the skills that were genuinely yours, the values you held even when they cost you something, the relationships that survived the collapse because they were never contingent on your former version, those are your materials. Pick them up deliberately. Carry them forward with intention. The parts of you that were performance, that were built for an audience, that cracked under pressure because they were never structural to begin with, leave them in the rubble. Not with contempt. With gratitude even because they carried you as far as they could. But leave them. The funeral for the old self was not a tragedy you had to survive. It was a necessary ceremony. And now you are on the other side of it, standing in the cleared sight, holding only what is actually yours. This is where people who rebuild after collapse consistently outperform people who never collapsed at all. Not because suffering makes you stronger, that is a comforting lie. Because the collapse forced a clarity that comfort never demands. People who never fall apart never find out what they are actually made of. They continue building upward and outward, never knowing which parts of the structure are load-bearing and which parts are just holding a shape. You know what held, you know what gave. And that knowledge, specific, hard won, impossible to fake, is worth more than any credential you could have accumulated on an uninterrupted path. Down the line in this book, we will get to a point about momentum, the idea that it must be continuous to be real that overturns the common assumption. And once you see that contradiction resolve, it will change how you measure progress from this point forward. But before that, there is a question you need to carry into the next chapter. Because the cleared sight is only an advantage if you know what you are building toward. And most people, even after a full collapse, even after they have stood in the rubble and felt the strange quiet of it, even then, they reach for the nearest familiar blueprint. What if the blueprint you were following was never drawn for you? Chapter 7. The new self does not need your permission. The new version of you does not arrive when you are ready. That sounds like a cruel thing to say, especially to someone who has been working hard, waiting, preparing. It sounds like someone moving the goalposts, but it is not cruelty. It is not a moving target. It is the exact mechanism by which most people stay frozen at the threshold of their own lives. For years, sometimes decades, holding the door open, waiting for a feeling of readiness that was never going to come. Readiness is not a condition that precedes the new self. It is a condition the new self produces after you have already stepped in. This chapter is about that step, not the preparation for the step itself. By the time you reach the end, you will understand why every version of you that hesitated at that threshold was not being careful. It was being held. That question from the last chapter is still ringing, isn't it? What if the blueprint you were following was never drawn for you? Most people hear that and feel a brief surge of liberation. Then, almost immediately, a second question rises, one they don't say out loud. If that blueprint wasn't mine, then what exactly am I building now? That second question is where the trap closes. The old self has one final move. It doesn't argue with you. It doesn't insist you stay. It simply asks you to wait a little longer. It says, prove you're ready first. Here is the open loop that will follow you through this chapter. There is a specific moment, not a feeling, not a decision, not a realization, but a literal moment in time when the new identity stops being a performance and becomes a fact. Most people never experience it. They are too busy auditioning. This chapter will show you exactly what that moment looks like when it happens and why it is available to you right now. Hold that question. It will close before this chapter ends. Return to your ordinary days before these last 3 years unfolded as it really was. Not just where you lived or what job you had. Think about who you were performing for. There was probably a version of yourself you were maintaining for someone, a parent, a group, a version of your own past that felt safer than the unknown. You were playing a character whose script had been written before you were old enough to have an opinion, and some part of you is still performing that character right now. Not because you want to, because you haven't been given permission to stop. That is the cost. Every day you spend auditioning the new self instead of declaring it, you pay a tax on your own life. That tax is not paid in money. It is paid in credibility, specifically, the credibility you extend to yourself. Each time you say, "I'll commit fully once I feel more confident, once I have more proof, once the timing is better," you send a signal to the deepest part of your operating mind. You are telling it that you do not yet believe the new self is real. That mind is a very literal instrument. It takes that signal at full face value. It does not argue. It simply continues organizing your behavior around the self you have already confirmed is real, the old one, the one that had to leave. James found this out in a way that was uncomfortable to watch and later almost impossible to ignore. He had spent 11 months doing what most people would describe as working on himself. He read everything. He made lists. He restructured his mornings and started waking at 5:45, not because he loved it, but because it felt like the kind of thing the new version of him would do. He told a few people he was starting a consulting practice focused on operations for small manufacturers. He had the knowledge. He had spent 9 years inside those systems at a company that no longer existed, thanks to a restructuring that took his role and 43 others on a Tuesday in November. He had the contacts. What he didn't have was the feeling. That settled, certain feeling he imagined successful people carried around in their chests like a warm stone. He kept waiting for it. And while he waited, he prepared. He refined his website 3 times. He rewrote his introductory email so many times that the draft folder on his laptop started to feel like a museum of his own hesitation. A former colleague named Dana called him one afternoon about a referral. There was a small metal fabricator 2 hours north that needed someone to assess their floor logistics. 3 days of work, honest pay, nothing glamorous. James told Dana he would think about it and get back to her. He said he wanted to make sure his materials were ready before he started taking clients. Dana was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that landed differently than she probably intended. She said, "James, you've been a consultant for 11 months and you haven't consulted anyone yet." He didn't call the metal fabricator that day. He called them the next morning. He didn't rewrite the email. He sent the one he had. He showed up on a Thursday in February with a notebook and a head full of everything he already knew. He introduced himself not as someone who used to work in operations, but as someone who does. Present tense. No qualification attached. The 3 days turned into a 12-week engagement. That engagement turned into 2 referrals. Within 90 days of that Thursday, James had billed more than he had made in any single quarter of his old salaried life. But here is what actually changed. Not the income, not the referrals. James stopped performing his old identity the moment he used present tense about the new one. That was the moment, not a feeling, not a revelation. One verb spoken out loud to a stranger. That is the moment the open loop promised you. The new identity is not earned. It is declared. This is the thing most people never hear stated plainly enough to act on. We are raised inside a story about identity that goes like this. First you do the work, then you earn the title, then you feel like the thing you've become. That sequence feels correct. It feels morally correct, even. It feels like the humble, honest, non-delusional path. But watch what it produces. It produces people who spend years doing the work without ever attaching the identity to it. People who say, "I'm still figuring it out," when a direct question about who they are gets asked. People who introduce themselves with an apology embedded in the description. And the world, which is not cruel but is very responsive, mirrors back exactly what they project. It sees someone who is still deciding. Declare it before you feel it. The feeling follows. This is not a permission slip for delusion. You are not being asked to claim expertise you don't have or credentials you haven't earned. James had 9 years of genuine knowledge. He was not pretending. He was withholding, which is a different problem entirely, and in some ways a worse one. Withholding is what you do when you have something real, and you are afraid that claiming it will expose you to judgment you can't yet absorb. The new self doesn't ask you to lie. It asks you to stop lying by omission. Now here is where continuity bias enters the room. Continuity bias is the invisible demand our culture makes on every person's story. It says a good life is a clean, unbroken arc. It says identity should be consistent. It says collapse is a sign of failure, and restart is something you do only after adequately explaining and apologizing for the collapse. Under that pressure, most people try to build the new self as an extension of the old one. They try to make it seem like they were always heading here. They sand the edges off the break. They say it was actually a blessing in disguise, which is often code for, "I am embarrassed by how lost I was, and I need you to see this as planned." But the break is not a flaw in your story. The break is the most important coordinate you have. It is where the old self stopped being able to take you any further. It is the necessary funeral. You are allowed to say that. You are allowed to stand at the grave without apology and name what was buried there. A little later, we arrive at an argument about momentum and how it is built that overturns the common assumption. When that idea snaps into focus, it immediately changes exactly how you start your next week. But right now, come back to the question of permission. You have been waiting for someone to look at the new version of you and say, "Yes, that's legitimate." A client, a mentor, a revenue number, a credential, a person from your past who finally sees you differently. You have been standing at a door you could open, waiting for someone on the other side to swing it from their direction first. The old self is very good at engineering that wait. It makes the wait feel like responsibility. It makes impatience feel like arrogance. It tells you that stepping into the new identity before you have sufficient evidence is the behavior of someone who doesn't take themselves seriously. It has been lying. No one who built anything real waited until they felt authorized. They decided. The decision created the conditions. The conditions created the evidence. The evidence created the feeling you've been waiting for. But the decision comes first always, and it is made without the feeling in the room. That is not recklessness. That is the actual sequence. You do not need to perform the old self for one more day, not for your family's comfort, not for the coherence of your own story, not for anyone who knew you before the collapse and finds the new version of you confusing or inconvenient. The self that had to leave has already served its purpose. You have been grieving at its grave. This chapter is asking you to stand up from that grief and speak in present tense. Not tomorrow. Not when it feels earned. Now is when the new self begins, and not a single moment sooner than when you say so. Chapter 8. Collapse coordinates show where wealth begins. Right now, something is leaking. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else can see, but every day you spend without a clear direction forward is a day your capacity compounds in the wrong account. The confusion you feel after a collapse is not just emotional pain. It is financial cost. It is time cost. It is the specific, invisible tax of moving in circles when you could be moving forward. And the cruelest part is this. The map you need to find your direction was already drawn by the collapse itself. You just were not told how to read it. What broke you is not the enemy of where you are going. What broke you is the coordinate. And once you learn to read collapse the way a navigator reads a landmark, nothing about your future stays uncertain in the same way again. You said it yourself. Somewhere inside, the new self begins when you say so. That sentence from before is not poetry. It is an operating instruction. The moment you say so is also the moment you need to know where to go. And this chapter is about exactly that. Here is the open question that will stay with you for the next few minutes. Why do two people survive nearly identical collapses and build completely different lives afterward? And why does one of them seem to find traction almost immediately, while the other spends years rebuilding the same structures that already failed? The answer is not luck. It is not timing. Hold that question. It will resolve before this chapter ends. Most people treat collapse as interruption, something that happened to the story, a gap between the real chapters. They want to skip past it, explain it away, smooth it over in the telling. Continuity bias does this to you. The culture rewards unbroken narratives, the resume with no gaps, the career with clean upward lines, the life that looks from outside like it was always heading here. And so when something breaks hard enough that the continuity can no longer be faked, the instinct is to treat the break as the problem. Fix the break. Get back to the line. That instinct is expensive, because the break is not the problem. The break is information. The most precise information you will ever have about yourself, more precise than any personality test, any journal entry, any advice from someone who cares about you but has never watched you fail. Collapse reveals what was not working. More importantly, it reveals the specific shape of what was not working. That shape is a diagnostic tool. Use it. There are 3 collapse archetypes. Not as a rigid system, life is not that tidy, but as 3 recognizable patterns that most financial and identity collapses fall into, each one pointing toward a distinct direction of rebuild. Learn to recognize yours, and the direction stops being a guess. The first archetype is the collapse of borrowed purpose. This is the one that happens when you have been living inside someone else's definition of success for long enough that the definition starts to crack under the weight of not being true. You took the job that made sense to the people around you. You built toward the goal that sounded right when you said it out loud at 22. You performed the version of success that was legible to your family, your neighborhood, your early ambitions. And then one day, it stopped working. Not because you failed at it. Often because you were succeeding at it and the success felt like nothing. Consider a man named David. He spent 11 years building toward a management position at a logistics company. He got it. Corner office, the title, the salary his father had told him was the mark of a man who made it. 3 months in, David started waking at 4 in the morning with a chest that felt like packed concrete. Not anxiety exactly, emptiness with weight to it. He told his wife it was stress. He told his doctor it was sleep issues. He told himself it would pass. It did not pass. It accelerated. He resigned 14 months after the promotion and spent 6 months unable to explain why to anyone, including himself. What David did not have was a language for what his collapse was telling him. He had collapsed from borrowed purpose. The specific diagnostic information inside that collapse was this: 11 years of competence in an area that was never his. 11 years of getting better at something that did not belong to him. The break was not telling him he was a failure. The break was telling him the precise coordinates of what he had been building toward, and that it was not his. For people in this archetype, the direction of the rebuild is inward before it is outward. The question is not what should I do next. The question is what do I actually want, not what do I want to want, not what makes sense, not what would impress the people who watched me collapse. What do I want? The rebuild for this archetype is almost always toward ownership, of time, of creative direction, of the specific problem you are solving and why. Entrepreneurs, independent practitioners, founders of small specific things, this archetype produces them disproportionately. Because the lesson of borrowed purpose is that you will not sustain motivation inside someone else's story long enough to build anything durable. The second archetype is the collapse of false foundation. This is the one that happens when everything you built was real, genuinely yours, genuinely chosen, but it was built on an assumption that turned out to be wrong. The income stream that depended on a single client, the business model that worked until the market moved, the financial life built on a partnership that dissolved. You were not living someone else's dream. You were living yours. The foundation just cracked. Think of a woman named Priya. She spent 4 years building a design consulting practice, slow and deliberate, turning down salary offers to protect her independence. By year 3, it was working. Real revenue, real clients, real margin. In year 4, her 2 largest clients were acquired by the same corporation within 8 months of each other, and the new procurement policies eliminated all contracts under a certain size. Priya lost 60% of her revenue in a single quarter. The collapse was not about who she was. It was about what she had built on. People in this archetype often make the mistake of rebuilding the same structure. Same model, same client profile, same assumptions, just with more effort this time. The collapse is trying to tell them something different. It is pointing to the exact structural vulnerability that failed. Not to say that structure was wrong, to say it needs a different foundation. For Priya, the diagnostic was client concentration. The rebuild was not about her skills or her market. It was about her architecture, diversification of revenue source, retainer models instead of project models, building a client base where no single relationship holds more than a certain percentage of her income. The direction the rebuild points for this archetype is structural, not emotional, not philosophical. Practical and architectural. The collapse of false foundation produces the most precise financial lessons of any archetype. The breakdown was concrete and the repair is concrete. If you recognize this archetype in your own story, you do not need to go inward first. You need to go structural. What was the single point of failure? And how do you design the new version so that single point cannot take everything down at once? Picture your ordinary days before these last 3 years unfolded as it really was. The specific assumptions you were operating on about how money was supposed to work in your life. Not the hopes, the assumptions, the things you did not even question because they felt like ground. Some of those assumptions have already proven wrong. Some are still holding. And the work this chapter is asking you to do is the work of noticing which is which, before the collapse makes you notice. The third archetype is the collapse of deferred identity. This one is quieter at first. It is the collapse that happens when you have spent so long preparing to become someone that the someone never fully arrived. One day the gap between who you are and who you were becoming grows so wide that the preparation itself collapses. The degree that was supposed to open the door. The skills you were building toward an opportunity that never materialized. The 10-year plan that required you to be a slightly different person than you turned out to be. A young woman named Camille spent 3 years in graduate school for urban planning, borrowed heavily to do it, and finished into a market that had almost no entry-level openings in her specific focus. She spent 2 years in adjacent work, unrelated, underpaid, accumulating resentment. Her collapse was not dramatic. It was a slow implosion of the narrative that said she just needed more time, more credentials, more waiting. The diagnostic for this archetype points directly toward applied proof of concept. Not more preparation, not more credentials. The collapse of deferred identity is telling you that the preparation phase is closed. What is needed now is direct, small, real action in the direction of the thing, not study of the thing, not proximity to the thing, not planning for the thing. The thing itself, in the smallest form that produces real-world evidence. For Camille, this looked like a paid project, small, specific, underpaid, that produced one piece of tangible output she could show. One proof that she could do the actual work for an actual client. That proof compounded faster than any additional credential would have. Now here is the answer to the question you have been holding. Why does one person find traction after collapse almost immediately, while another spends years rebuilding the same thing that failed? The one who finds traction reads the collapse as coordinates. They ask what specifically broke, what the shape of that break reveals, and what direction that shape points. They are not trying to recover the old life. They are reading the data from the end of it. The one who spends years rebuilding what failed is not weaker. They are simply working with an old map in new territory. They have not yet accepted that the collapse was the last moment of the old self, that a necessary funeral happened, the grief was real, and the thing that has to leave is the assumption that the rebuild looks like the original. The shape of what collapsed is a diagnostic. Every detail of what broke, how it broke, and what it felt like from inside, that is not trauma to process and set aside. That is information to use. The specific thing that broke points toward the specific thing that needs to be built. Not the same thing reinforced. Something new, informed. You are not starting over. You are starting from the most accurate information you have ever had about yourself. What does the shape of your collapse tell you about the precise direction you have not yet been willing to go? Chapter 9. You are the one who planned this funeral. Every culture that survived long enough to leave a record understood something about death that the living tend to forget. In every era, across every tradition, there existed a particular kind of ceremony, not to mourn what was lost, but to honor what the dying made possible. The elders who designed these rites were not being cruel. They understood that some endings are not accidents. Some endings are arrangements. And the people who presided over those ceremonies with the most grace were not the ones who had nothing to do with the death. They were the ones who, somewhere deep inside, had known it was coming, who had quietly, without fully admitting it even to themselves, prepared the ground. That is you, right now, in this moment. You are not a mourner at the grave of your old self. You are the one who planned this funeral. That question the last chapter left you with, what the shape of your collapse tells you about the precise direction you have not yet been willing to go, that question is not rhetorical. It has an answer. And the answer changes everything about who you believe yourself to be. Here is the open question this chapter wants you to hold. If you were not the victim of your collapse, then what were you? Do not answer yet. Let that sit. Revisit your ordinary days before these last 3 years unfolded as it really was. Not abstractly, actually place yourself there. The apartment, the job, the version of the plan you were following, the story you were telling people at dinners when they asked how things were going. You were holding something together. You were maintaining. And some part of you, the part that runs quieter than your conscious voice, already knew that what you were maintaining had an expiration date. You felt it as restlessness. You felt it as a low-grade dissatisfaction you could not quite name. You felt it as the uncomfortable awareness, appearing usually at 2 in the morning, that the life you were presenting was not quite the life that was true. You did not create the collapse out of weakness. You created it out of honesty. There is a woman named Mara who spent 6 years building a consulting practice that looked, from the outside, like exactly what she had planned for. The clients were steady. The income was real. Her parents told their friends about her. She had a title she could say at parties that made people nod with a particular kind of respect. And one Thursday morning she sat at her desk, looked at a perfectly ordinary email and could not make herself reply. Not because she was tired, not because the email was difficult, but because some negotiation inside her, one she had not been consciously conducting, had finally concluded. She closed the laptop. She told her assistant she was taking the afternoon. She sat in a park for 3 hours and did not call anyone. When she went home that night, she already knew the practice would be closed within 6 months. She had not made that decision with her rational mind. Her rational mind was still arguing, still running numbers, still trying to find the version of the story where she stayed. But the decision had already been made, by the part of her that sees further than spreadsheets. Mara spent a year believing she had failed. She built an entirely convincing case for her own weakness. The evidence seemed solid, but the evidence was wrong. What she had actually done was carry out an operation she had been planning without knowing she was planning it. The consulting practice was not destroyed by circumstance. It was dissolved by a self that was no longer willing to be contained inside it. The grief was real. The loss was real. And underneath both of them, so was the authorship. You are the author. That is not a comfortable thing to hear. Authorship means responsibility. And responsibility, when you are sitting in the rubble of what used to be your life, feels unbearable. It is so much easier to be a victim of events than to be the architect of a necessary ending. Victimhood requires nothing of you going forward. Authorship requires everything. But here is what authorship also gives you. It gives you the one thing that victimhood never can. It gives you the evidence that you are capable of decisive action. Even when that action happens below the level of your awareness. Even when it looks like chaos from the outside. Even when it costs you relationships and income and the particular kind of self-respect that comes from maintaining a consistent story, the action happened. You moved. You cleared the ground. Continuity is the story society sells you as safety. The idea that a good life is a straight line, oneself leading smoothly into the next, no gaps, no ruptures, no dramatic reinventions. That story is not safety. That story is a cage. The demand for an uninterrupted narrative has kept more people trapped in the wrong version of their lives than almost any other force you will encounter. Because the moment you break the line, the moment there is a visible gap in your story, every voice around you wants to call it failure. And if you agree with them long enough, you start to believe it too. You do not have to believe it. The collapse is coordinates. You have heard that before in these pages, but now you are ready to hear what coordinates actually mean. Coordinates are not where you fell. Coordinates are where you are standing, and they are only useful to someone who has already decided to move. What does it mean to preside over your own funeral with gratitude? It means you stop performing grief for an audience. It means you stop apologizing for the ending as if the ending were an error. It means you look at the thing you lost, the income, the identity, the plan, the version of yourself that other people had grown comfortable expecting, and you say quietly without drama, you served what you were meant to serve. And now the service is complete. That is not spiritual bypassing. That is not pretending the pain was not real. The pain was real. The funeral metaphor holds because grief is real, because loss is real, because the person who used to live inside you walked this earth and had a name and made promises and disappointed people and tried and failed and tried again. That person deserves to be mourned, fully, without rushing to the next chapter. But the mourning and the authorship can coexist. You can grieve the self that had to leave and still understand that you called the departure. You can miss the life that ended and still recognize that you were the one who ended it, because some precise knowing inside you understood it had to be done. These two things are not in conflict. They are the whole truth, and most people only allow themselves one half. The half that lets you move forward is the authorship. Not the half that erases pain, but the half that reclaims power. The half that says, I did not merely survive a collapse, I arranged one. I did not merely endure an ending, I authored it. And if I authored that, I can author what comes next. This is where the first question of the chapter resolves at last. If you were not the victim of your collapse, you were the architect. Not a reckless one, not a careless one. A forward-looking one who could not yet see the full blueprint but knew, in the way the body knows before the mind catches up, that the current structure had to come down, so something true could be built in its place. The self that had to leave was not your failure. It was your first proof that you will not stay somewhere that no longer fits you. And that refusal, that deep, costly, sometimes devastating refusal, is the same force that is going to carry you into everything that comes next. The question the final chapter will answer is this: now that you have claimed the authorship, what do you build? Chapter 10. The audiobook that found you already knew. You made it here. That fact deserves more than a moment, it deserves examination. Not because you finished something, but because of what finishing reveals. You did not stumble into this final chapter by accident. You did not drift here passively while life happened around you. Some part of you chose this, chose to keep going, chose to sit with discomfort instead of turning away. And here is the thing most people skip right past. That choosing is not a small thing. That choosing is data. It is the first hard evidence of who you are becoming. You have been generating that evidence for every chapter of this book without fully realizing it. Think about that for a moment. The version of you who started this book, where was that person? What were they afraid of? What had they lost or were in the process of losing? That person had questions they could not quite form into words. Something in them knew those questions existed. Something even deeper knew the answers were somewhere ahead. That deep knowing is not mystical. It is directional. It is the compass the new self uses before it even has a name. Here is the open question that has been waiting underneath this entire book. This is the place it finally gets answered. If the old self had to die, what exactly was the funeral for? Go back to the beginning with me for just a moment. Early in this book, the funeral was grief. It was the ceremony you did not want to hold for a life that no longer fit, for a version of yourself that had stopped working, for the story you had told about who you were that had quietly become false. You resisted that funeral. Almost everyone does. because a funeral means something is over, and over feels like failure in a culture that treats consistency as virtue and collapse as character flaw. That is the villain in this story, not a person. Not a market crash or a bad decision or a relationship that ended. The villain is the idea that a good life is a smooth life, that a worthy person does not require reinvention. That starting over is something you do when you were wrong to begin with. That idea is everywhere. It is in how people talk about careers, about money, about relationships, about identity itself. Continuity gets rewarded, collapse gets whispered about, and so you carry your collapsed self in private, wondering what it means about you, not realizing that collapse is not a verdict. Collapse is coordinates. Coordinates tell you where you are. They do not tell you where you belong. The moment you have precise coordinates, the moment you know exactly how far off course the old self had drifted, and in which direction, you have something more valuable than a smooth, uninterrupted life ever gave you. You have an honest starting point. Nadia was 31 when her graphic design business dissolved. She had built it over 4 years, slow and careful. Then a single quarter of bad client decisions and one partner who walked away left her with almost nothing. She sat in her apartment for 3 weeks convincing herself she was grieving a business. What she was actually grieving was a version of herself she had outgrown without knowing it. The business was built by a woman who needed approval at every stage, who priced her work low so clients would say yes quickly, who avoided the bigger contracts because bigger contracts meant more scrutiny. That woman had done her best, but she had also quietly been holding Nadia back from the clients who would have recognized what she was actually worth. The collapse did not take Nadia's talent. It took the container that was too small for it. 8 months later, she signed a contract worth more than her best full year. She did not find new confidence. She found the one that had always been there, waiting for the smaller version of herself to get out of the way. The self that had to leave made room for the one who was always waiting. You have been in Nadia's apartment, maybe not literally, but you have sat in the quiet that follows collapse and tried to figure out what it means about you, what it says about your worth, whether this is the kind of thing people recover from. The answer you were looking for was never in the rubble. It was in the fact that you kept looking. Call up your ordinary days before these last 3 years unfolded, as it really was. Not the circumstances, those shift constantly, but who you were inside them. What you believed was fixed about yourself, what you thought was possible, what you would not have allowed yourself to imagine. Compare that person to the one listening right now. The distance between those two people is not empty. It is full of decisions and small resistances and moments where you chose not to quit even when quitting would have been easier. That distance is the architecture of the new self. You built it, mostly without noticing. Here is the revelation that closes everything this book has been building toward. This audiobook found you because you were ready. Not ready the way people mean when they say they are waiting to feel prepared. Ready the way a field is ready after a season of rain, not finished, but alive and capable. The readiness was already operating inside you before you pressed play on the first chapter. The fact that you sought this out, that you stayed, that you are here in the final minutes, that is not the result of the new self. That is the new self. It was functioning before you gave it a name. The old self waited to feel ready before it moved. The new self moved and recognized readiness in the motion. That is the difference. That is everything. And here is what you build now. You build on honest ground, not on the story that collapsed, on the coordinates the collapse revealed. You make decisions from the person who sat through the funeral and walked out the other side. Every choice made from the older identity was slightly wrong in the same direction, angled just enough off-center that the error compounded over time. Every choice made from the identity you have now, the one forged in collapse, tested in discomfort, clarified by loss, has a different quality. It has the quality of someone who is no longer performing a self, someone who is actually being one. Money follows that, not because of magic, because the decisions you make when you are performing a self are different from the decisions you make when you are being one. The contracts you pursue, the rates you set, the rooms you walk into, the conversations you are willing to have, all of it shifts when the person making those choices is no longer protecting a fiction. The funeral was not for you. It was for the fiction. And now you are standing at the end of this book, which means you are standing at the beginning of something the old self could not have reached. Not because the old self was weak, because the old self was the necessary first draft. Every version of you that collapsed was doing exactly what it needed to do, carrying you as far as it could before the next version had to take over. That is not failure arranged chronologically. That is growth, which is rarely graceful and almost never feels like progress from the inside. But you are on the outside now. You can see the shape of what it built. The audiobook found you because you were already moving toward it. The readiness was yours before the first word, and every chapter confirmed what you already knew in the place beneath knowing, that the self who had to leave was not the end of your story. It was the price of admission to this one.